My physicians were excellent men and women. I want to say that first, because what follows is not a criticism of their learning or their care. They had given 20 years of training to the Velorath body, its particular mechanics, the way our nervous system carries grief differently from most species in the compact. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that people use when they say grief lives in the body, but literally, measurably, in the bioluminescent pathways that run from the base of the skull to the sternum and light the skin from beneath in moments of strong emotion. They knew this system. They had mapped it, studied its failure modes, written the literature that defined how the Velorath sin manifested in infants and what it required to resolve. They were wrong about one thing, a small thing as it turned out. But in medicine, as in governance, the small errors are sometimes the ones that cost the most. I am not a man who narrates easily. I have given speeches from podiums and addresses to councils and formal statements to registries, and I have done all of these things with the specific competence that the position requires, but narrating, telling a thing from the inside, in sequence, admitting what you did not understand while you were inside it, is a different practice. My wife was good at it. Yaveth could describe the interior of any situation with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of someone who found other people genuinely interesting. And when she described things, they became clear not just as events, but as the specific texture of being alive inside them. I have tried since to learn how she did it. I have not fully succeeded. But I am trying now, because the thing I am trying to tell is the kind of thing that deserves to be told accurately. And accuracy is the one skill I can claim without qualification. Sale was 22 days into the Velorath sin, when I first understood what was happening with the laundry cart. I should tell you about the Velorath sin, for those who did not grow up with the medical literature. In adults, it is a period of physiological recalibration after the loss of a bonded partner, a process that takes months, is uncomfortable but not dangerous in healthy individuals, and is characterized by a dimming of the bioluminescent pathways and a disruption of sleep architecture. In infants, it is more acute. The infant Velorath system is still forming its anchoring references, the biorhythms, the olfactory signatures, the particular quality of one person's presence that tells a small body what settled feels like. When that anchor is removed before it has fully registered, the system does not know what to calibrate to. It keeps reaching for a thing that is not there. My son had been reaching for his mother for 22 days. He was not eating well, he was not sleeping. He cried in the specific way that Nurse Velseth described to me as concerning. The physicians had assembled a panel on the 14th day and produced a document that I read in my study at the 3rd hour of the morning, and then placed face down on the desk because I could not look at it any further. They described the situation accurately. They described the interventions they had attempted. They described the Velorath sin's physiological requirements, the biorhythmic resonance of a bonded Velorath adult, preferably one who had known the mother intimately, preferably one who carried her olfactory signature in their own patterning. They had tried 12 people, every senior Velorath household member who had known Yaveth. They had tried me. I had stood at my son's alcove on the 9th night, and I had held him and hummed and walked the oval the nurses had demonstrated, and he had cried harder. I understood that I was not the right frequency for this, that my grief and his grief were not the same grief and could not hold each other up, that I was his father and I loved him with everything I had, and there was a specific thing that love could not do here, and that specific thing was this. I placed the document face down on my desk, and I went to the nursery corridor, and I sat outside the door for 2 hours in the dark. I did not know, yet, that there was anything to find. I had been taking the corridor route past the nursery at the 3rd and 4th hours most nights since the 14th day, when Nurse Velseth had suggested, with the careful diplomacy of someone delivering bad news to a sovereign, that my visits were not helping. I had understood what she meant, and I had not stopped coming. A father does not stop going to the corridor. He stands outside the door, and he listens to the quality of the crying, and he counts the minutes between the peaks, and he builds a private data set that he cannot do anything with. And this is one of the more honest things I know about grief. It makes you precise about things you cannot fix. On the 23rd night, the first night, in the way I have come to organize the timeline, I arrived at the corridor at the 4th hour and the crying was not there. This registered slowly. I had been arriving for 9 nights and the crying had always been present, and its absence required a moment to parse. I stood in the corridor and listened to the quiet, and then I went to the door and pushed it open 1 inch. The room was in amber light. The monitoring equipment cycled at the far wall. In the sleeping alcove, my son was on a woman's shoulder, and the woman was walking a slow oval around the room, and she was humming. I did not recognize her immediately. She was facing away from me, a plain woman in a palace maid's work clothes, moving with the patient, unhurried quality of someone who has been doing this for a while and expects to do it for longer. The humming was not a melody in any formal sense. It was a low, repetitive thing, almost beneath music, the kind of sound that exists in the back of a room when someone is working without thinking about the noise they are making. My son's fists were unclenched. I stood in the 1-inch opening and I watched, and I did not go in and I did not speak. The maid completed her oval and began another. My son slept. The monitoring equipment showed readings I had been watching for 9 nights and had not seen in this configuration. I withdrew from the door and stood in the corridor for a long time. I did not sleep that night, but it was a different kind of not sleeping, not the vigil grief of the previous weeks, but the wakefulness of a man who has been shown something he does not yet have a category for and is working, as he was trained, toward understanding it. I came back the next night. I pushed the door open the same inch. She was there, the same maid, the same slow oval, sail asleep on her left shoulder. I watched for 40 minutes. I withdrew. On the 3rd night, I watched her manage the second wave. I had read about the second wave in the physician's literature. The second peak of Velorathsen distress in infants, occurring at approximately the 2nd hour, which had been disrupting Sale's sleep even on the better nights. The physicians had not been able to hold him through it. The wave typically woke him, and the settling process had to begin again. I watched this woman sense the wave's approach before it crested. She felt it in the way he moved against her shoulder, some small signal I could not read from the doorway, and she shifted her weight forward and the hum moved upward by a fraction, and the wave came and passed without taking him. I went back to my study, and I sat at my desk, and I thought about my physician's document, and the 12 people they had tried, and the conclusion they had reached about Velorath biorhythms and olfactory signatures, and the specific resonance they had said was required. Then I thought about a palace maid humming something without a name, and my son's unclenched fists, and the wave passing. I looked up her name in the household records. Myra Kale, lower laundry wing, 4 years in the palace. Before that, a pressing service in the district where she had grown up. No medical training, no Velorath physiology, no connection to Yaveth that the records could establish. They had worked in entirely separate wings of the palace, and I found no evidence they had ever occupied the same room. She had come in because the door was open. I knew this before I asked her, because the records and the circumstances made it clear. She was not selected, not assigned, not directed. She was running late one morning, and the door was 3 inches open, and the crying was on the other side of it, and she had hands. That was the complete mechanism. Those were all the pieces. I came to the corridor every night for the next week. I stood in the doorway and watched, and she never once looked at me. I cannot tell you with certainty whether she knew I was there or was carefully giving no indication of it, and I have never asked because some questions are better left as the specific quality of the thing they were. She walked her oval. She hummed her non-melody. My son slept through to the 6th hour, then the 7th, then, on the 9th night, the full 8th hour for the first time since Yaveth died. I stood in the doorway on that 9th night, and I watched Myra Kale place my son in his alcove with the particular care of someone who has learned the exact angle, the exact weight distribution, the exact quality of transition from held to lying down that will not pull a sleeping child back toward waking. She had learned this by doing it 30-odd times over 9 nights. No instruction, no certification. Just repetition and attention, and the specific patience of a person who cares about getting a thing right. Yavith had a word for that quality. Velsorathren in the old tongue, attending to a thing as though it matters, which in Velorath philosophy is considered both a practical skill and a moral virtue. The physicians had Velsorathren in abundance when it came to their instruments and their readings. It had not been enough. This woman had it about my son, and it was. I was still in the doorway when Preen Velsorn arrived on the 10th night with his light and his guards. He was doing his job. I want to be precise about that. Preen was the head chamberlain of the imperial palace, a man of considerable competence and 30 years of service, and a maid without authorization in the imperial nursery handling the imperial heir was not a situation his function permitted him to ignore. He was procedurally correct. He was temperamentally precise. He came at the 3rd hour with the light and the guards, and he opened the door and he said, very quietly, he understood the room required quiet, her name. She did not look up. She tightened her hold on my son and kept humming, because stopping the hum was the thing that would wake him, and she had learned this on the 3rd night, and she kept her priorities in order with the same evenness she kept everything. Preen said, your employment will need to be reviewed. She looked at the sleeping child. She looked at Preen. She said she would move him in 1 hour when the 2nd wave had passed, because moving him now would wake him. She said this the way she said most things, as a practical constraint plainly. Preen looked at the monitoring display. He looked at my son. He was doing a calculation. I could see it from the corridor, the calculation of a man whose filing system is meeting information that changes the weight of the matter being filed. He said 1 hour. I came in before the hour was done. I stepped into the doorway fully this time, not the inch, after Preen's guards had positioned themselves and after the 2nd wave had come and gone, and I said her name. Preen turned. I told him he could go. There was a moment. 30 years of service and considered persistence, I have always respected it, but he went. I went to the far side of the sleeping alcove and I stood there and I looked at my son and I said, how long? She told me, since the 1st night, through to the 6th and 7th hour most nights. The 2nd wave passing without waking him since the 4th. She gave me the data with the plainness I had been watching from the doorway for 10 nights. No softening, no performance of reassurance, just the accurate account of what had happened. The physician said it required Velorath physiology, I said, a specific biorhythmic resonance, someone who had known her. I know, she said. I read the briefing in the common areas. I don't have any of that. No, I said. You don't. I looked at her directly. She looked back and the directness was not disrespect. It was the look of a person who has committed to honesty and is waiting to see if honesty is what the situation requires. I decided it was. What do you do? She thought about the question with visible care. I hold him, she said. I walk just a slow oval, nothing particular. I hum. Something my mother used to hum, there's no proper tune to it. She paused. And I stay. I think the staying is the largest part. I thought about the document face down on my desk. I thought about the 12 people and the conclusion that had followed. I thought about an infant's unclenched fists and the 2nd wave cresting and passing in the amber quiet of a room where one person had decided to stay when no one had asked her to. He has her brow, I said. It was not what I had intended to say, but it was what came. The shape of it. She looked at the sleeping child for a moment. I see it, she said. He'll grow into it. She said it without inflation and without softening, which was exactly the register I needed. and which no one had found for me in 22 days of saying things with great care. Just, he will grow, and the feature will grow with him, and that is true and can be said plainly. I thought, I have been surrounded for 3 weeks by people who are managing their words around my grief, and this woman is simply telling me the true thing. I found the second chair and sat down. We did not talk much that first night, but we talked on the nights that followed at length, with the specific freedom of conversations that happen at the third hour when both participants have decided the room is the right kind of room for honesty. She told me about her mother's pressing service, about the philosophy of handling things carefully, about what it meant to her to make a thing right and give it back. I told her about Yaveth, about the flowers in the Eastern Garden, which Yaveth had selected specifically for their night-blooming varieties, because she had said a child who sleeps at night should have something worth waking for. About the habit Yaveth had of pressing her fists flat against her sternum when she was working through a difficult question in council, which was now visible in the face of our son every time something concerned him. About the word Velsorathren, and why I had been carrying it for weeks without anyone to give it to. Myra Kale listened with the quality that she brought to most things, complete attention, no performance. She did not offer comfort when comfort was not the right thing. She offered presence and accurate replies, and occasionally the specific thing of simply allowing the silence to be silence, which is a skill that is rarer than people admit. Sale improved across those weeks, incrementally, genuinely, in the way that real recovery accumulates rather than announces itself. Nurse Velseth told me on the 28th night with the compressed relief of a woman who has maintained professionalism for a very long time and has reached its structural limits that the child's feeding had changed and the readings had shifted and she would like me to come and see. I came. I saw. He was reaching for things, looking at everything, making the sounds of a living creature, finding the world interesting enough to catalog. I called the medical council together on the 40th day. 9 physicians and Preen Velsorn, the monitoring records, the timeline, the data presented accurately without editorial. I showed them what the readings had been on the 23rd day and what they were now. I showed them the specific pattern of improvement correlated with the specific nights. I said, the mechanism does not match your published understanding of Velorath-Sen physiology. I said, I would like you to study it. Then I said, before we proceed to the research questions, there is an administrative matter. Myra Kale stood in the anteroom adjacent. I had asked her to attend and she had come without asking why, which was characteristic of her. When I said come in, she came in, and she stood in the council chamber the way she stood everywhere, straightforwardly, without performance, ready to be honest. 9 physicians and 1 head chamberlain looked at a palace maid in her work clothes, standing in the Imperial Medical Council chamber. She did not lower her eyes. Myra Kale, I said, lower laundry wing, 4 years in this palace, no Velorath physiology, no medical training, no prior connection to the Empress. I paused. 23 consecutive nights in the Imperial nursery, unauthorized because the door was open and the child was crying and she had hands. The room was very quiet. I am going to speak 3 sentences in the old tongue, I said. They are the Velorath First Form Acknowledged Presence Address. The House has not extended this designation to a person without standing in 400 years. We are extending it now. I looked at her. She looked at me with the honest, direct, not particularly intimidated expression of a woman who has decided that honesty is the correct approach to the Emperor of the Velorath sovereign line, and is carrying that decision through to its conclusion. My house has seen you, I said. My house names you, and my house will not set you aside. The room remained quiet. From the monitoring data on the table in front of my chief physician, my son's readings, the current readings, the ones from this morning, showed the standard baseline of a healthy 6-month-old Velorath infant. I said, the designation Velorath Mira is created this day for Myra Kale, with full household standing. I said, The research into the mechanism is authorized and her participation is her own choice, freely made. I said, I would like a moment with the council's newest recognized person. They filed out. Preen Velsorn, as he passed, made the small expression that meant, noted, filed, proceeding. I had seen it twice in 30 years and I was glad to see it a third time. The door closed. The council chamber was very quiet. Myra Kale said, I don't know what Velorathmira means. Keeper of the light, I said. It means you are part of this house. Named not as staff, as a person the house has seen and will not forget. She was quiet for a moment. What does it require? Nothing you have not already given. She thought about this with the visible care she brought to most things. Then she said, what did I give? I thought about the 40 days. The oval walked in amber light. The hum without a name. The second wave passing. The chair dragged from the corridor and the chair I had found and sat in on the other side of the alcove, and the quality of the room on the first night I sat in it, adjacent to peace. I thought about Velsorathren and the one person who had it in the specific form my son required. You stayed, I said. When the door was open and you could have pushed it closed and walked on. You came back when no one asked you to. You stayed through the night when no one would have known if you hadn't. I paused. That is what you gave, presents given freely without calculation. She looked at me for a long time. She was not a woman who filled silence with noise. I had hands, she said quietly, and he was crying. Yes, I said, I know. She nodded once, then she said, will Sale be all right? The name, not the title. His name, in the way she said it in the nursery when she was talking to him directly, already a person who could be spoken to like a person. Yes, I said, he will. She nodded again. Then she said she should return to the upper corridor collection, because she was already several hours behind and she had a system, and the system was already disrupted, and she preferred not to fall further behind. I looked at her, then I said, go. She went. I stood in the council chamber after the door closed. The morning light was coming through the high windows, the eastern light, the same light that reached the nursery and fell on the flowers Yavith had chosen. I thought about Yavith, and the flowers and the Velsorathren she had taught me to name, and the woman who had just walked out of the council chamber to do the laundry. Then I went to the nursery. Sale was awake. Nurse Velseth was doing her morning routine, and he was in the alcove watching everything with the broad, interested gaze that meant he was finding the world worth cataloging. He saw me come in. He made his sound, not yet words, but the particular vocalization that meant, I am here in this light, and you are a person I recognize. I sat at the edge of the alcove and put my hand flat against the cushion beside him. He looked at it for a moment, considering, and then grabbed two of my fingers with the grip that small children use when they are not asking for anything specific, but want the connection confirmed. His fingers were warm. His fists were open. Outside the high window, the eastern garden was doing what it did when the morning light reached it, the night-blooming flowers folding back into themselves, and the day varieties opening in their place. Yavith had known all their names. She had told me, sitting in this light in the weeks before Sale was born, that she wanted the garden to be complete across the full rotation, something open at every hour, day and night, so the room was never entirely without it. She was right about most things. I held my son's fingers, and I watched the garden complete its rotation, and I thought about a woman in the lower wing moving through a linen collection with the same careful, unhurried attention she brought to everything, because Velsorathren did not distinguish between the things it was applied to. Either you attended to things as though they mattered or you did not, and Myra Kale attended, and it had turned out that attending was the one thing the Empire's entire medical literature had not known how to prescribe. His fingers were warm. The flowers were opening. The morning was doing what mornings do when there is something still worth having them for. It was enough. It was, I had been slowly learning since the night, A laundry cart stopped outside a nursery door 3 inches open. Exactly enough. There are things you learn about a person by watching them in a room they do not know they are being watched in. I am aware that this is not a flattering thing to admit. The emperor standing in a 1-inch doorway for 10 nights, watching a laundry maid hold his son while she believed herself unobserved. But I have decided that this account needs to be honest, and the honest version includes that I watched her with the particular attention of a man who has been wrong about something important and is trying to understand where the error was. The error was not in the literature. The Velorath-Sen research is sound in its observations. The biorhythmic resonance is a real mechanism. The olfactory anchoring is measurable. The failure of the 12 people we tried was genuine, and its cause was what the literature said. The error was in a different assumption, unstated in the document, the kind of assumption that goes unstated because no one thinks to question it. That the only thing a Velorath infant's nervous system would recognize as an anchor was a Velorath nervous system. What Sale's system recognized in Myra Kale was not Velorath physiology. Corvin Velseth spent the better part of the following month with the monitoring data and came to me, eventually, with the conclusion framed in careful language. What the infant system appeared to calibrate to, in the absence of its maternal anchor, was Velsorath-Ren itself. The quality of attending, not the biorhythm, not the signature, the specific, measurable quality of a nervous system that is fully present to the thing it is attending to and has brought no other agenda into the room. 12 Velorath adults, including his father, had held that child and brought grief and urgency and love and desperation into the room with them. These are not flaws. These are what people bring when the person they love is failing. But they are agendas, in the specific neurological sense that the infant system was apparently measuring. A nervous system oriented partly toward its own state rather than wholly toward the child's. Myra Kale had come in because the door was open. She had no grief for Yaveth. She had not known Yaveth. She had no urgency about the Velorath-Sen because she had not known the diagnosis. She had no love for the child yet, in the way that love requires time and accumulation. She had hands and a tuneless hum and the specific quality of a person who, when she picks something up, puts everything else down. Corvin said, in the formal language of his report, the human subject's neurological presentation in the nursery environment showed 0 secondary agenda markers. He said, the infant's calibration to the human subject appears to have proceeded on a Velsorath-Ren basis independent of biorhythmic or olfactory similarity. He said, this has implications for current Velorath-Sen intervention protocols that we will need to study extensively. What he was saying, translated out of clinical language, was, she was simply present. She was more present than any of us managed to be, and that turned out to be what he needed. I thought about this for a long time after Corvin's report. I thought about it in the context of the conversations I had been having with Myra Kale in the nursery at the 3rd hour, which were the most honest conversations I had had in the 40 days since Yaveth died, and I tried to understand why. I came eventually to the same explanation. She brought no agenda to those conversations either. She did not manage her language around my grief. She did not calibrate her responses to the weight of my title. She offered the honest thing plainly and waited to see if that was what was needed, and it almost always was. There is a passage in the old philosophical texts, pre-compact, the period before we had a term for Velsorath-Ren as a formal concept, that describes the quality as follows. The person who tends the lamp tends only the lamp. Everything else can wait. The lamp cannot. Myra Kale tended the lamp. In the most literal sense, she was given the designation Velorath-Mira, keeper of the light, because the old tongue had a phrase for the thing she had been doing, and the house needed to name it. She worked in the imperial nursery for the first 4 months after the designation was formalized. Not as a nurse, she had no nursing training and was clear about this from the beginning, but as what I can only describe as the person who came when the second wave came, the person who walked the oval when the oval was needed, the person who hummed the nameless hum. As Sale grew out of the acute phase of the Velorathsen and into ordinary infancy, her role shifted naturally, less the oval and more the general presence, which in practice meant she spent several hours each day in the nursery wing and continued to do the laundry, which she insisted on because she had a system, and she preferred to keep her systems operational. We talked every day, sometimes in the nursery, sometimes in the corridor, occasionally in the small sitting room off the nursery wing that I had begun using instead of my study in the evenings, because my study was where I had read the physician's document face down on the desk, and I had not yet made my peace with the room. She told me about her district and her family and the pressing service that her mother still ran in the same building after 30 years. She told me about why she had taken the palace posting and what she had expected, and what she had found different from her expectations. And her account of the palace from the perspective of the lower laundry wing was the most clarifying description of the institution I had heard in 4 years of living at its center. I told her about the governance work, the actual mechanics of it, the particular satisfactions and frustrations of running a sovereign house in the compact's current political arrangement. I told her about the decisions I found difficult and the ones I found straightforward, and she asked questions about the difficult ones with the specific quality of someone who is not trying to solve the problem, but is genuinely interested in understanding the shape of it. I had advisors who were technically more qualified than a palace maid to discuss governance questions. None of them had her particular gift for asking the question that clarified the shape of the thing rather than suggesting the answer. She said once, about a territorial negotiation I had been describing, "It sounds like they want you to choose quickly, but they need you to choose correctly, and those are different problems." I stopped. I said, "Yes, exactly that." She said, "Well, the pressing is the same way." I said, "The territorial negotiation is the pressing." She said, "The ambassador wants the linen back fast. The ambassador needs the linen back without wrinkles. You can do one, or you can do the other correctly." I thought about this for several days. Then I resolved the negotiation in the way that her framing suggested, which was to slow the timeline explicitly and explain why, and it worked. When I told her it had worked, she said, "Good, the ambassador will have smooth linens." I could not tell, and still cannot, whether this was a joke. With Myra Cale, genuine and wry were often the same voice, and she saw no reason to distinguish them. Sale learned to walk when he was 14 months old, which was on the early side for Velorath infants, but consistent with his general tendency toward deciding things were possible before the literature suggested they should be. He learned to walk in the nursery wing corridor, and the first person he walked to was Nurse Velseth, and the second was me, and the third was Myra Cale, whom he called, in the vocabulary of a child who is inventing language as he goes, something that sounded like Myra and had the specific tone of a word that means, "This person is mine and I have named her." She looked at him when he said it. She looked at me. I did not say anything because it was a moment that did not require my interference. She crouched down and held out her hands, and he walked to them. The monitoring equipment at the far wall registered his bioluminescent pathways in the warm, steady glow that meant, "This is a child who is settled, who has an anchor, who knows what the world feels like when it is right." She picked him up. She held him against her left shoulder. He had always preferred the left, and he put his face against her neck, and she hummed the hum without a name. And for a moment the nursery had the quality it had had on the first night I pushed the door open 1 inch. The room where the work had been done, and the one who needed keeping, was kept. I stood in the doorway, not 1 inch this time fully, and I watched. Yavith would have had a word for it. She had a word for everything that mattered in the old tongue, precise and without excess. I was still learning them, but I thought, Velsorathren, attending to a thing as though it matters, bringing nothing else into the room. The lamp tended, the light kept. Enough. The research Corvin Velseth conducted over the following year was published in the compact medical journal under the title, Velorath Sen in Infancy, Non-Biorhythmic Anchoring Mechanisms and Implications for Intervention. It was the most read paper the journal had published in a decade. Practitioners across 12 systems sent letters. 3 academic institutions requested Corvin's extended presence for symposia. Myra Kale, when I told her, said, "That's good then," and went back to checking the linen fold count against the morning inventory, because she had noted a discrepancy in the supply from the eastern apartments, and discrepancies in the supply count were not things she was willing to leave unaddressed. I had asked her early in the year whether she wanted to be involved in the research in a formal capacity, to give testimony, to attend the reviews, to have her name on the record in the way that contributed to something being understood. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "Corvin understands the mechanism. He doesn't need me to explain it. He needs to explain it to people who weren't in the room, and that's different work, and it's his work, not mine." I said, "Your name will be in the paper." She said, "That's fine." I said, "People will know what you did." She said, "People will know that Velsorathren is measurable in an infant nervous system's anchoring response, which is useful. Whether they know who was in the room when the data was gathered is less important." This was characteristic of her. She had a very precise understanding of what information was load-bearing and what was supplementary, and she applied this understanding to her own position without self-deprecation and without false modesty. She had done a specific thing. The thing had mattered. What followed from it was not about her. Sale, by contrast, was entirely clear that it was about her. By the time he was 2 years old and in possession of enough language to have opinions, he had organized his world into a hierarchy of reliable presences, and Myra Kale was at its center alongside Nurse Velseth and me, in an arrangement that he found entirely natural and that no one had explicitly designed. He brought her things he found interesting, which at 2 years old meant primarily small objects with interesting surfaces, which he would carry to wherever she was working and hold up for her inspection. She inspected them with the seriousness they were offered with, and returned each one with an accurate observation. The stone is heavier than it looks. The gear is brass, not copper. The seed is the kind that spirals when it falls. Sale received these observations with the satisfaction of someone who has been given correct information, and filed them in the specific way that small children file things in the body, not the memory, as knowledge that is simply now true about the world. He did not know, at 2, what the Velorathmira designation meant, or that there was a document in the palace records with his name and hers on the same page, and the word recognized beside both. He knew that she was there, and that when she was there the hum was there, and that both of these things were among the features of the world he could rely on. He had organized himself around them the way you organize yourself around reliable things, unconsciously, in the specific way that trust works when it has been present since before you had words for anything. I watched him do this over those months, and I thought about Velsorathren and what it meant to attend to a thing as though it matters. I thought about the quality that Corvin had measured in his paper, the 0 secondary agenda markers, the full presence indication, and I thought about what it would mean to raise a child in proximity to that quality. Not to teach it, not in the deliberate instructional sense, but to give him the experience of being in a room with a person who was simply present, day after day, so that he would grow up knowing what it felt like and would recognize it later, in the rooms that mattered, in the people who mattered. Yavith would have approved of this. She had Velsorathren herself, in the specific quality of attention she brought to governance. She had brought it to the council meetings and the treaty negotiations and the small moments in between, the corridor conversations and the breakfast hours, and the particular quality of her listening, which was the thing I missed most acutely and most specifically, the thing for which there was no substitution or approximation. But she had also believed, in the practical way she believed things, that people learned most of what they needed to learn from being in rooms with other people who had already learned it, that the transmission was atmospheric, not instructional, that you could not teach a child Velsorathren. You could only be it near them long enough that they absorbed it from the air. I thought about this on the morning of Sale's second birthday, when he woke early and insisted on being taken to the Eastern Garden, which he had developed a strong opinion about at some point in the previous 6 months. I took him to the Eastern Garden at the 6th hour, in the particular early light, and he stood in the middle of the path and looked at the night-blooming flowers in the process of closing for the day, and I watched his face do the specific thing it did when something registered as important: a stillness, a narrowing of the wide gold eyes, a quality of attention that I recognized with the particular ache of recognition that looks like someone else first. He pressed his small fist flat against his chest. His mother's gesture, the one the physicians had noted in the early weeks as a sign of the Velorathsen's acute phase, but that had been a distress expression then, the fists clenched and tight. These fists were different. These were the thinking fists, the processing something important fists, the same fists I had watched in council footage of Yaveth working through a difficult position at the negotiating table. I stood very still. He stood in the garden with his fists against his chest, and he looked at the closing flowers, and then he looked at me and he said, in his 2-year-old's vocabulary that was rapidly becoming very specifically his own, "Pretty." I said, "Yes, very pretty." He said, "Mama's." I said, "Yes, your mother chose them." He looked at them for a while longer, his fists unclenched. He took my hand and we stood in the Eastern Garden in the early morning light, the night-blooming flowers folding away and the day varieties opening to replace them, the rotation completing itself exactly as she had designed it, something open at every hour, so the room was never without it. That evening I told Myra Kale about it, in the sitting room off the nursery wing where we had taken to spending the hour before I returned to the study for the evening's governance work. I told her what he had said, and the fists pressed to his chest, and the word "pretty." She listened with her full attention, the way she listened to everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He knows then." I said, "Knows what?" She said that it was hers, that she was real and made things, and those things are still here. I said, "He is 2 years old." She said, "Yes, he knows anyway. Children know things before they have words for them. They just wait for the words to catch up." I thought about that. I thought about the specific way she had said it, not as a philosophical observation, not as comfort, but as a practical fact about children that she had derived from spending 2 years in close proximity to one. The pressing service daughter, the laundry wing maid, the Velorath Mira with her 0 secondary agenda markers and her hum without a name. I said, "Yaveth would have liked you." She said, "I would have liked her." The sitting room was quiet. Outside the window the evening was doing its evening work, the light shifting through the stages that led to the hour when the night-blooming flowers in the Eastern Garden would open again, and the cycle would begin again, and the garden would be, as she had designed it, complete. I said, "She would have argued with you about the optimal temperature of the morning grain drink." Myra Kale looked at me. Something in her expression moved a small, precise shift, the expression of a person receiving information that changes the shape of something. She said, "Was there a correct temperature?" I said, "She had reached a position on it, yes." She said, "What was it?" I told her. She thought about this for a moment with the seriousness she brought to temperature questions. Then she said, "That's 12 degrees too warm. It compromises the secondary grain notes." I said, "I will relay your objection." She said, "It won't help. She's probably right. She did the research." I said she did, on most things. The sitting room held that for a moment. Not silence exactly. the kind of quiet that has the warmth of something recent in it. She had Velsorathren about this too, I thought, about the space between people where something important had been and was not anymore. She brought the same full presence to the grief as she brought to the laundry, and the hum and the oval walked in amber light. She did not manage around it. She attended to it as though it mattered, because it did, because everything she attended to mattered, and that was simply the quality she had. The lamp tended, the light kept. My son was sleeping 3 floors above us in the alcove with the high window, his fists open, his bioluminescent pathways in the steady warm glow of a child who is settled and knows it. In the eastern garden the night-blooming flowers were opening. The cycle was completing itself, as she had designed it, as it would complete itself every night for as long as the garden grew. I held my hands in my lap, and the sitting room was quiet, and it was, as it had been every night since a laundry cart stopped outside a nursery door and someone had hands and the door was open. It was enough. It was, and would continue to be, exactly enough. I have been trying to write this account for a long time. I started it 3 times, and each time I stopped because the thing I was trying to capture kept slipping from the language I was reaching for, the formal registers I had been trained in, the precise ceremonial vocabulary of the Velorath sovereign house. Those languages are very good for what they are designed to describe. They are not designed for this. What Yavith's language was designed for, the interior of situations, the specific texture of being alive inside them. I have been trying to learn it and I have not fully succeeded, but I have gotten further than I expected, and I will tell you why. On the night of the Velorath Mira designation, after the council had filed out and Myra Kale had gone back to the upper corridor collection, and I had stood in the council chamber for a while, and then gone to the nursery to hold my son's fingers while the flowers opened. On that night, I went back to my study for the first time since I had placed the document face down on the desk and walked away. The document was still there. I picked it up. I read it again, all of it, and then I placed it in the file where it belonged, and I opened the desk drawer, and I took out the small book that Yavith had given me on the occasion of Sale's birth. She had written in the front of it, in her handwriting, "For the things that should be described accurately and with warmth, because both are required and neither is sufficient alone." I wrote the first entry that night. Not this account, just the first night with the laundry cart and the 1-inch door and the unclenched fists. 1 paragraph, but it had the quality she had described, accurate and warm, because the thing it was describing required both. I have been adding to it since. I am adding to it now. The Velorath Mira is in the nursery at this moment, or she will be by the time this page is done. My son will bring her something with an interesting surface. Currently, he is fascinated by anything that has a visible grain, wood or stone or woven fabric, the texture that reveals the making of a thing. She will receive it seriously and tell him what she observes about it accurately, and he will file the information in his body and go find something else. The monitoring equipment will show what it has shown for many months, a child who is settled and knows it and expects to remain so. Outside the window, the eastern garden does its rotation. Day and night, something open. She designed it that way. I have learned to describe this accurately and with warmth because both are required. Both are enough.